Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. This book was originally published back in 1811, and I listened to an audio edition of this read delightfully by Rosamund Pike. So Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen is the second of the Austen novels that I've chatted here on my channel. I previously chatted Pride and Prejudice, and I will link to that down in the details below. So spoilers about Sense and Sensibility. This book is over 200 years old, but if by some miracle you've managed to avoid reading the book or watching a series adaptation of it or just hearing about the plot, I will be not revealing anything in this chat that would detract from a first-timer's experience with this book. And if you are a first-timer, you would be probably in for a treat if you like this kind of story. So what is this one about? Our setting is around 1800, I think, in England. Typical sort of Jane Austen type setting. As the novel kicks off, we are introduced to the Dashwoods. The Dashwood sisters. Eleanor's about 18 years old. She has a sister, Marianne, who's about 17. And then she has a younger sister, Margaret, who is 13. The sisters do have a half-brother, John, who is older than they are and already married and has a family of his own. His wife's name is Fanny. So as the novel opens, though, their father, Henry Dashwood, is ill, gravely ill, and on his deathbed. And due to the way that the estate was arranged from his uncle who had the estate before Mr. Dashwood, the estate is going to go to its entirety to John on the death of Henry, with nothing for Henry's second wife, Mrs. Dashwood, as well as Eleanor, Marianne, and Margaret, the sisters. And so Henry Dashwood is very concerned about this because he had not had time between the death of his uncle and his own impending death to make arrangements for them. So he's very worried about this, and he calls John to his bedside and makes him promise that he will take care of his stepmother and his sisters. And John promises, yes, he will take care of them, not to worry. Now, John is already wealthy because he had inherited money from his mother who had passed away, as well as he had married a woman, Fanny, who had money of her own. So he's very well situated as it is. But nevertheless, as happens sometimes with these family dramas, his wife, Fanny, starts to talk him out of giving very much money to his stepmother and his half-sisters. And so before it's all said and done, the amount that he's actually going to give them has been whittled down indeed to a very, very small amount. Not only that, but John and Fanny are going to take possession of Norland Park, the house where they live, right? So they're going to have to move. So Mrs. Dashwood and the sisters Mrs. Dashwood's looking for another place to stay, which is kind of difficult given her very limited income. So John, though it seems to be pretty oblivious to this, he thinks that they're very well set up. But in actuality, they are very much struggling. As it turns out, though, Mrs. Dashwood has a cousin, Sir John Middleton, who offers them the cottage on his estate called Barton Cottage. His estate's called Barton Park, and the cottage is called Barton Cottage. And so Mrs. Dashwood and the girls move there, and they're very happy to have it. So that's when their new life sort of begins, right at the beginning of the story. But when they're in Barton Cottage, they do encounter some more characters. And I thought how I would approach this chat is also just talk a bit about the main characters. So first, a little bit about Eleanor, the oldest daughter. So Eleanor's thought of as being quite sensible, right? Sense and sensibility, quite sensible. She's very pragmatic. She's the oldest. She seems to make decisions for the family. In some ways, she's the most mature, even more mature in some ways, I think, even than her mother. She's got control of herself really all the time. She's a very self-controlled person. There is one quote from the book that really illustrates this. She sees something that's really causing her a lot of anxiety, and she says to herself, I will be calm. I will be mistress of myself. She is going to take control of herself, and she's going to keep control. And that's just the way she's wired. Her sister, Marianne, though, is kind of almost the complete opposite. Marianne is hopelessly romantic. She is everything. She sees everything in emotional and romantic terms. And so she doesn't know how to be reserved even. She says exactly what she means. She can't lie. Eleanor says to Edward, who I'll introduce here in a bit, do not you know my sister well enough to understand what she means? Do not you know she calls everyone reserved who does not talk as fast and admire what she admires as rapturously as herself? That really describes Marianne, because she lives this very emotional life where she sees everything, beauty and truth and these great ideals. And anyone who doesn't see the world in her way, or she thinks doesn't see the world in her way, she thinks they're hopelessly sort of just reserved and dull. But Edward Ferrars, who I mentioned earlier, is the brother of Fanny. So it's the brother of Eleanor and Marianne's sister-in-law, Fanny. Edward meets Eleanor, meets the family while they're still at Norland Park, actually. And he and Eleanor have a really tight, really quick connection. It's very obvious to everyone around them that they have a connection that everyone sees. He's a very shy guy, but he nevertheless really sort of has this connection to Eleanor that his sister notices and she does not like. And she says offhand to Mrs. Dashwood, just casually, that if Edward were to marry against his mother's wishes, she would disinherit him and he would have nothing. So this, sort of is a sort of coded message to Mrs. Dashwood, like Eleanor's not going to be good enough for Edward. But Edward is very shy, like I said. He says about himself, I never wish to offend, but I am so foolishly shy that I often seem negligent when I am only kept back by my natural awkwardness. Shyness is only the effect of a sense of inferiority in some way or other. If I could persuade myself that my manners were perfectly easy and graceful, I should not be shy. Edward's just very likable in this sort of shy, gentle way. And Eleanor really is attracted to him that way. Not so much Marianne. Marianne thinks he's reserved and rather dull. But some of the other characters that they meet at Barton Cottage is Colonel Brandon. He's 35 years old, so he's a little bit older. Marianne thinks he's hopelessly old, hopelessly infirm, and hopelessly dull. Nevertheless, he basically is crushing on Marianne pretty seriously. Everybody sees this, but Marianne really has nothing, doesn't want that much to do with him because she thinks he's so much older than her. John Willoughby is a young man that's kind of the opposite of Colonel Brandon. Very charismatic, very handsome, young as well. Now, he catches Marianne's eye. The only one that sort of maybe sees through him a little bit is Eleanor. Everyone else finds him extremely charming. And he hangs out at Barton Cottage with the family a lot, and with Marianne, to the point that, and Marianne, of course, has no discretion. She goes off on carriage rides with him and whatever. So everyone in the neighborhood begins to think they have an understanding, which in around 1800 in England, an understanding is not quite an engagement, but nevertheless, it's kind of like a promise. And so if there is an understanding, it's almost as good as a formal engagement as far as the prospect of marriage. Everyone assumes this for Marianne and Mr. Willoughby. Mrs. Jennings is the mother-in-law of Sir John Middleton, who is the cousin of Mrs. Dashwood, who is the owner of Barton Park, and his wife. He and Sir John and Mrs. Jennings share a sort of personality, sort of a jolly, teasing kind of personality. They love to surround themselves with young and vibrant people. Lady Middleton, Sir John's wife and Mrs. Jennings' daughter, is not. She's rather reserved and she's not really into that so much. But Mrs. Jennings is just a really delightful character, I think, in the books. Colonel Brandon's ever present at Barton Park. Mrs. Jennings always trying to matchmake people, and she sees right away that Colonel Brandon's probably lost out to Mr. Willoughby as far as for Marianne. But, you know, as far as John Willoughby goes, eventually he up and leaves and goes to London. And so sort of leaving us all wondering what's going to happen with him and Marianne. However, the opportunity soon arises through Mrs. Jennings for the girls to go to London as well. And so, you know, we get a bit more of the story there that I won't give away here. That's really the rest of the story, is what happens with these main characters and how their lives intertwine. So just some thoughts about Sense and Sensibility, the title itself, Sense and Sensibility. So sense can have a couple of different meanings, right? Sense can mean sense, like I have sense, I have good sense, meaning I have good judgment. But it can also mean the senses, life through the senses, like sensing things. Senses like Marianne, right? Sensibilities means having pretty good judgment, right? Having able to navigate the senses and have good judgment. This to me would be Eleanor, and this sort of mirrors Mr. Willoughby and Colonel Brandon. Mr. Willoughby being the sense and sense of emotion, and Colonel Brandon in the sense of being a sensible person, and likewise with Eleanor and Marianne. Marianne being the sense, living life through the senses, and sensibility. Eleanor living life through the sensibility, you know, the practical sort of-ness. So to me, that's sort of kind of the key of the title. There's a lot of different meanings there. I think it's just so cool. This is a Jane Austen novel, right? So we know that things aren't, in this particular novel, things don't end happy necessarily for everybody in the novel, but they end the way we think they should, right? It's a Jane Austen novel. So things turn out the way we think they should, the way I thought they should anyway at the end. So it was just a lot of fun to read. I always enjoy these. You know, I'm reading my way through the Jane Austen novels, so I will have some more coming up in the near future. However, my next read is going to be some historical fiction, Circe by Madeline Miller, which I have finished already. And I will have a chat on this coming up very soon. So until next time, take care.